Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I am Tony Gerdeman, here as always with Tom Orr. Tom. How is it going? Couldn't go any longer than that.
Definitely a new high score there. Yeah. I don't know if you were worried that maybe this won't be long enough for a full episode. We're going to really stretch that power pause out for about 15 minutes. All right. Well, good news. We have enough for an episode now. So yes, Tony, I'm fantastic. How are you?
Oh, thank you for asking. I'm doing pretty well. Looking forward to this episode, finishing up our listener questions, really exploring the room, talking about some things that are important to people, are really important to the country, and anything we can do to help people get through their day and make them feel better as people, then I'm here for that.
All right. Well, let's start with at Buckeye AM. Who do you believe will be our top wide receivers next season and top tight ends? I think, Tony, and my answer to this starts with, much like the question that we got on the last episode, it depends on who comes back. Your thoughts?
Well, then we can just break this down. Let's talk about Marvin Harrison said he is still undecided. We can go ahead and decide for him that he's going to leave. And if he changes his mind, we might do a podcast about that. I don't know that we necessarily need to do a podcast about him leaving, but we probably still will. So we can count him out. We know Julian Fleming is gone. So then it becomes with or without Emeka Egbuka. And the lineups are pretty interesting because let's assume Emeka Egbuka comes back, and for whatever reason he decides to do that. This is our thought exercise on him coming back. And we may have talked about this on the live Buckeye Weekly this past week about what does he want to be in the draft. Does he want to be an inside receiver, which he would be now? Does he want to come back and show that he can be an outside receiver like Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Marvin Harrison, those guys? Because the draft slots between Jackson Smith and Jigba at 24 and Garrett Wilson at 10, pretty considerable. So if he did come back, I wonder if it would be because part of that is I want to show that I am an outside receiver, while also clearly his numbers were about half of what they were a year ago. And so you want to just have a productive season and help your draft stock in any way possible. But say he is an outside, say he's the Z next year, Tom, if he comes back and he's the Z, what do you see in the slot and at X in terms of the starters? And then maybe we could talk about who's behind them.
I think I'm going to say that, I mean, Carnell Tate has to be one of the places for sure. He's sort of the next man up in that wide receiver room and has sort of followed the career trajectory of some of the younger guys or the older guys who you mentioned in terms of Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave and Jackson Smith and Jigba, where even as true freshmen, you sort of saw more of him as the year went along. All the stuff you've heard behind the scenes about him, even going back to when he was a high school player, has just, it sort of matches in terms of work ethic and just, the coaching staff just absolutely loving him. So I think he's going to be one of those spots. And if I put him at X, I don't want to just be looking at recruiting rankings, but does Brandon Inniss become the H in that case? I mean, you've got Jaden Ballard, you've got some other guys who are sort of in that mix, and Noah Rogers and Bryson Rogers from last year's class, and you didn't see Keon Grays at all. I think from, again, Brandon Inniss is one of those guys who came in and was probably, college ready-ish and just didn't, that was a very, very talented wide receiver room, so you can understand why he didn't get on the field, but you saw the long touchdown against Purdue. It feels like he's probably someone who might take on a much bigger role next year. I mean, if it's Emeka Egbuka outside and Carnell Tate and Brandon Inniss, which one of those am I wrong about?
I don't think you're wrong about any of those because those are the three that I had in that order. I think Brandon Inniss is tailor-made to be a slot receiver at Ohio State. Now, he's going to have competition. We've seen Bryson Rogers there. Well, I think we'll see Jeremiah McClellan there, true freshman. You can't expect a true freshman to compete for a starting job. So you look at the 2 second-year guys. Well, by the time this show airs, Tom, we might be talking about receivers who are no longer on the team, and there may be some portal guys. Like obviously, Jaden Ballard is an outside guy. We don't know what's going to happen with him. He stuck it out for this long, and you've got the two Keon Grays and Kojo Antwi from the 2022 class, 2 of the 4 remaining guys from that class. And so where do they fit in? And really, like the 2023 and 2024 class of receivers are really, really interesting for Ohio State. And I think it's, if you just have a room, if there's no Emeka Egbuka, and we can move past Emeka Egbuka, move past Marvin Harrison, move past Julian Fleming, you could have a room of just first and second year guys next year, which I think is one reason why they're going to try to keep the veterans if they can. And then I say veterans, upperclassmen, I should say, rather than veterans. But you're talking Noah Rogers, Bryson Rogers, Carnell Tate, Brandon Ennis, Jeremiah Smith, Mylan Graham, Jeremiah McClellan. All of these are fantastic and really interesting prospects, but it would be a young room if the upperclassmen don't stick it out and provide something. But again, that doesn't mean they're going to play. This is still going to be very obviously a competition and merit-based thing. It's just they could be looking at a very, very young room next year.
Absolutely. And it was an intentional thing that I didn't mention the true freshmen, just because I think that's, you can't assume those guys are going to come in and week 1 or even week 4 be those guys. You go back to Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. Those guys were, Garrett Wilson, I think, might have had a long touchdown against Miami in a game that was like 76-5 or something like that. So, you'll see them, so like Jeremiah Smith, that's the name everyone's saying in their heads, so we'll just say it out loud. You may see Jeremiah Smith early. It would be quite a historical anomaly for Jeremiah Smith to be a starter week 1 as a true freshman. I know what the expectations are. I know what the hype is. I know what people whose opinions I respect have said about him.
Mm-hmm.
I also know what Marvin Harrison did at Ohio State and what Marvin Harrison did as a freshman at Ohio State. And I know what Garrett Wilson did at Ohio State and what Garrett Wilson did as a freshman at Ohio State. And Chris Olave and Jackson Smith and Jigba and everyone else. Jackson Smith and Jigba had that incredible toe tap touchdown in the first game of the 2020 season against Nebraska, and then finished with 10 receptions, something like that, 11 receptions that
10.
year. 10, yeah. All of those guys had these incredible careers, and you don't get to see it right away at the beginning of the freshman year. I think, you could have, I think Carnell Tate's 2022 to 2023 to 2024 that we're sort of projecting. I think Jeremiah Smith, I think you could see him with bigger numbers than Carnell Tate had this year. But what did Carnell Tate have this year? 15 catches, something like that. It was not that many. You're going to see Jeremiah Smith, and Mylan Graham and McClellan. This is another incredible class for Brian Hartline. You're going to see some of those guys, but I think if you just asked people what's a reasonable over-under for Jeremiah Smith, I think people would be like, I don't know, 900 yards, something like that. It's like, go back and find me a true freshman in the long and storied history of Ohio State wide receivers who put up 900 yards or 700 yards or even 600 yards as a true freshman. That doesn't really happen. So when we're sort of leaving those guys off to the side in this conversation a little bit, that's kind of why.
And I'm trying to remember the true freshmen at Ohio State who have done the 30 receptions as freshmen. I think it's Chris Carter, David Boston, and Garrett Wilson. I don't believe I'm missing anybody. We talked earlier before this season, could Carnell Tate get there? And so right now he's at 17 catches for 260 yards. I don't expect him to get to that 30 catch thing, but I also wonder, Tom, do you think he would have gotten there if CJ Stroud was the quarterback this year?
Now that's an interesting question. Boy, and there's layers to that too, because you're more explosive on offense. And if you're more explosive on offense, you are getting to bigger leads. The defense is still just as good. So, boy, you are painting a picture that is going to get a lot of our audience very upset. And I'm sorry to have to walk this out in front of all of you guys. Tony did it, not me. You're getting the backups so much more run because you're pulling away from teams much earlier. I mean, Youngstown State. What's the Youngstown State score if C.J. Stroud is Ohio State's quarterback? I mean, are they up by 50 at halftime?
I was thinking 49-0.
Yeah, I mean, so somewhere in the 49 to 50 point range. I mean, anywhere in that range, somewhere right in that. And what did that game end up? 38-6 or something like that? I mean, that's one where the starters might be out in the middle of the second quarter if it's, C.J. Stroud. That's, oh man, what are Marvin Harrison's numbers this year if C.J. Stroud is his quarterback? Anyway, Tony, you're getting people upset again. Stop it. Carnell Tate having 30 receptions and 500 yards or something like that, it's not out of the realm of possibility if C.J. Stroud's there. I mean, I don't mean to channel Rick Pitino here, but C.J. Stroud is not walking through that door. So who is Ohio State's quarterback for next year, Tony? And then I'll tell you the likelihood that Jeremiah Smith reaches, the 30-catch, 500-something yard level for 2024.
Well, and whatever Carnell Tate does in the Cotton Bowl, I think he's going to outdo his average. So if we say 5 catches, because again, if he's going to be playing, he may be starting in that game, quite frankly, and he may be the number 1 target in that game, quite frankly. So if you give him 5 catches for 60 yards, that puts him at 22 for 320 on the season. And I think that's very similar to what Marvin Harrison had in the Rose Bowl, minus the touchdowns. I think Marvin was like 5 for 83. So if we say 22 for 320, assuming that all of the receiving starters are gone from this year, which moves everybody up on the pecking order next year. If I set the over-under on Jeremiah Smith at 22 catches for 360 or 320 yards.
Over. I mean, if you're taking Julian Fleming in the portal, Emeka Ibuka, Marvin Harrison, both turned pro, and you've got 3 open wide receiver spots, I don't know if Jeremiah Smith is starting on day 1, but I'd put my money on a, Buster Tillman, David Boston 1996 situation where your starter week 1 is not necessarily your starter week 5, 6, whatever. You get into that rotation pretty early. Jeremiah Smith, Brandon Inniss, Carnell Tate. That is a real young room. But I mean, I'm kind of intrigued to see what that might look like.
Well, this is the same thing that I put this question on the board, on the Buckeye Huddle message board. If you're not yet a member, become a member, and you can see what I'm talking about. A week or 2 ago, before anybody had hit the portal at quarterback, I asked them, so who are you starting? If nobody moves, who are you starting at quarterback next year in your EA Sports college football game at quarterback? And the overwhelming response was Lincoln Keenholz. And I'm saying the overwhelming response for the starting 3 receivers for the Buckeyes next year on many of those same, from many of those same people are probably Jeremiah Smith, Brandon Inniss, and Carnell Tate. Even if Emeka and Marvin Harrison return, they're like, no, you are old news. People want the new news. And it is, obviously, it's some very talented receivers in that room. And really, there would be an opportunity for him to get into that 30 reception club. I'm not ready to go there yet. We will definitely have some projection shows. We've got, I don't know, Tom, 9 months to 8 months to really start to get those projection shows done. But for the first guess, I would agree over the 22 and 320, just because somebody's got to catch the passes. If everybody's gone to the NFL and off into the portal, somebody else is, he might be. I think the Tillman thing, and if people don't remember the Buster Tillman, David Boston thing, Buster Tillman was a senior in 1996 and started like the first 6 games. And then David Boston, who was a true freshman out of Humboldt, Texas, eventually took over after 6 games and then went on to have, I don't know, like 33 catches and 460 some yards. It wasn't a big year, but you could see that this dude was going to be legit, and he was the next 2 years and really was that season. Not unlike Santonio Holmes as a redshirt freshman when he took over for, I think, Drew Carter, and really put up his numbers were as good as Michael Jenkins through the second half of 2003. And I could see that definitely happening next year.
And Drew Carter, I think that was a knee injury at Indiana, if I remember correctly. So that wasn't even just that Santonio Holmes just beat him out. That was an injury thing. So, that's 20 years ago. So how much direct application is there to today?
A lot.
I don't know. But Ohio State did throw to the tight end a bunch 20 years ago. So let's talk a little bit about what that tight end room might look like. And Tony and I did a little bit of a breakdown of this on a emergency episode of Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning when the Joe Royer transfer news came out earlier in the week. This is another one where I feel like the answer is it depends. If Cade Stover comes back, and he could theoretically come back, then Cade Stover is your leading tight end reception person. And, honestly, to the point where it might take catches away from some of the wide receivers. That also, boy, with such a young wide receiver core and a first-time starter at quarterback, having a really nice, steady, proven tight end like Cade Stover, boy, that would be a nice security blanket for whoever is Ohio State's starting quarterback in 2024. I don't know that I'm not expecting it necessarily, but it's also not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, I think, Tony, a question within a question. I'd like you to rank these 4 Ohio State skill players in order in terms of likelihood that you feel that they return for 2024. Travion Henderson, Emeka Egbuka, Marvin Harrison Jr., and Cade Stover. I will spot you the first one. Least likely to return, Marvin Harrison Jr.
This is a tough one, Tom. And because the problem is I could be totally wrong. And
that's why I asked you before you could ask me. Yes, keep going.
I don't want people to see me being wrong. It's, crush their entire worldview of things. Least likely to return is Marvin Harrison. I think my next least likely to return, and I'm maybe wildly off on this one, I would put Cade Stover, and then I would go Emeka Egbuka, and then I would go Travion Henderson. And maybe the logical answer there is that Cade Stover is the most likely to return. But some guys after 5 years, you're like, I'm ready to move on. I am so tired of school. Like, who after 5 years has not been completely done with school? But that's my initial thought. And again, I may be way off. I think they'd love to have everybody, but that's where I am, Tom. Let me ask you that very same question so that you can be on the record about it.
Well, Tony, I'm going to say the nicest thing I've ever said to you about anything. Your answer was defensive. I could see it. I think Travion Henderson is probably the most likely to return, and Marvin Harrison is the least likely to return, and then Emeka Egbuka and Cade Stover. It's a matter to me of Emeka Egbuka could, he's projected to go higher than Cade Stover. So you could have the argument like get in, start that first contract, get a year closer to that second contract. And Cade Stover is probably a little bit more of an is what he is guy. Cade Stover is not going to materially change his draft stock very likely by coming back for another year. So that would be the argument for Emeka Egbuka, leaving or Cade Stover leaving. The argument for Emeka Egbuka coming back is, as you said earlier, you could move from the end of the first round to the middle of the first round, something like that, or the early second round to the middle of the first round. That's a significant difference in terms of your, that first contract for Emeka Egbuka. So that would be the argument for coming back. And Cade Stover, if you're we looked this up earlier in the week, and he was projected from like a 3rd to a 5th round kind of pick. You could make substantially the same amount of money at Ohio State through NIL as you would potentially in some of those draft slots. It really obviously depends on where you fall and all that within that range. And you may, an Ohio kid may just want to come back and be a part of a win over Michigan and a go to the Big Ten championship game and a go to the college football playoff and have a chance to maybe make a run. This is all stuff that you kind of go in and sort of throw your hands up and go, sure. I will say, which one did you say was second most likely? Emeka Egbuka?
I said second most likely to leave is Cade Stover.
Okay, well then I will say second most likely to leave is Emeka Egbuka, just to be different and difficult. And, so they're a very scientific approach to this. If Cade Stover does go pro, then your tight end room is G. Scott. It's Jelani Thurman. It's Bennett Christian, who sat out the 2023 season because of a substance test, a positive test for a banned substance. Sam Hart still in that room. You've got a couple true freshmen coming in. You've got Zach Herbstreit, who people were sort of talking about as like maybe he's going to be the fullback kind of guy, and then had a medical condition that he missed the whole season. So of that group, G. Scott's probably would be my projected first person there if you don't have Cade Stover back, and Jelani Thurman's probably my second. But, I think there's the field might be close to a co-favorite, because do you bring in a transfer guy at that point, or do you ride with Scott and Jelani Thurman? And then, Bennett Christian and Sam Hart, for various reasons, have not really played. So we don't really know what they have right there with those guys. The coaches probably have a better sense for it, but I feel like G. Scott and Jelani Thurman are probably my 1 and 2 in terms of who's the leading receiver in some order. And then I might say the field for the third most likely.
And those two, G. Scott and Jelani Thurman, are pretty interesting prospects. They're different prospects, but they're both athletic and versatile. I could see, now Tom, this might be a little extreme, but I think this is a way that things could go, is you use G. Scott like Brock Bowers, and you use Jelani Thurman like Darnell Washington. And Thurman is not as big as Washington, but they are like, this pair is similar to this pair in that they are both different, but they have their athletic abilities that can be used in different ways. Whereas G. Scott is the receiving tight end, and Jelani Thurman is your blocking 12 personnel tight end. I would love to see what G. Scott looks like as the number 1 target in the tight end room, as Cade Stover being used down the seam, and what he looks like getting 30 targets in a season, 35 targets, because I think he has not been maximized to the point where he could be. And we know this has been a very long and pointed process. They knew, G. Scott, when he made the move, this wasn't going to be tomorrow I'm going to be an outstanding tight end. They knew it was going to be part of a process. I could see that process taking a pretty big step in 2024 as a unique number 1 target that can be used all over the field, but you've got to do it. And he's gotten much better as a blocker. He's continued to grow in every way, but I would like to see what he can do as the number 1 target among the Ohio State tight ends, because we've never gotten to see that yet.
Yeah. And, coming in as a wide receiver, he has the background to handle the receiving portion of it, and the blocking has gotten better. It's probably not still exactly where they want it to be, but he's certainly improved and bulked up to the point where he's now officially tight end sized. The other great variable here that we don't know is how much 12 personnel are they going to be running in 2024, because we don't know who the starting quarterback's going to be. We don't know, is this going to be much more of a dual threat kind of guy than they had with Kyle McCord in 2023? Probably. I mean, virtually everyone who's sort of in that conversation, whether guys currently on the roster or guys who you've sort of seen them linked to in the transfer portal, is a little bit more dual thready. So does that mean, and if you're looking at, is it, Chip Trayanum is in the transfer portal, Mayan Williams off the NFL draft, Evan Pryor is in the transfer portal. So the only two guys who are potential returning running backs from the 2023 season are Travion Henderson, who we talked about earlier, and Dallin Hayden. Those are both, a little bit more outside kind of back. So is this more of like a read kind of offense where you're trying to run a little bit more read option kind of stuff? How does that impact the two tight end, the use of two tight ends in the formation? Is the wide receiver unit just so good that they are going to run 11 personnel because you just can't bear to take any of the wide receivers off the field? I mean, these are all the kind of questions that play into that answer. And, I think I'd like to have some more follow-up questions before I, officially plant my flag on anything here, because I think there's a lot of moving parts here that we don't know yet.
Yeah, that's a coward's way out, Tom. I don't need any more information to make broad sweeping judgments and statements. I will go ahead. I do wonder if there is a plan to replace what they have done with Mitch Rossi, Chip Trayanum. Like, do you go into the portal looking for that second back? Do you use G. Scott that way? And if you do, then that kind of takes away what I just said about him being the number one target. Because I do think they like having that H back, not the slot, but the H portion version of the tight end fullback. So is there somebody out in the portal as a tight end, as a running back that you want to get that will do that? And is that really a way to lure somebody in? Hey, we'd kind of like you to come in and be like this blocking fullback, but we will throw it to you sometimes. And if you're a running type of person, maybe we can even give it to you. It won't be a lot, but you will get to run into a lot of linebackers and defensive tackles. If that does that pique your interest? It's going to be a very violent situation. It's not going to be pretty. Probably won't pay much, but you will get beaten up. What's it going to take for me to get you into this bar fight with these 320-pound defensive tackles?
Hang on, I'm just going to Google whether Matt Keller has any kids who are potentially high school senior type age. That is kind of like a throwbacky kind of role. And, Caden Curry filled that in the goal line role this year. I would expect if Caden Curry is the starting defensive end next year, which I'm sort of guessing he will be, depending on who ends up leaving. Tony, once again, the fullback role, who will play the fullback role for the Ohio State team, as everyone would expect, going to hinge a lot on whether JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer declare early for the draft. But I would guess that Caden Curry is playing a bigger role on defense next year, which means Caden Curry is going to be probably one of your fullbacks next year. Is Zach Herbstreit able to come back? We don't know that yet. Is there someone else? You might be able to pull. I can't imagine a fullback blocking tight end kind of guy is going to be a 7-figure NIL request. That feels like there's, can you find the next Mitch Rossi? Feels like that guy should be available in the portal. That if you don't feel like you have him on this team. The other question is, okay, who's next year's Xavier Johnson? Because, not necessarily in an off-field, captain and block O jersey kind of role, but, the guy who makes plays in space. And they've got 3 running backs currently committed for the 2024 class, Jordan Lyle, James Peoples, and Sam Williams-Dixon. I could see Sam Williams-Dixon maybe turning into that guy. I don't know if he's that guy day one. Does Dallin Hayden, is it Travion Henderson and Dallin Hayden are together in the backfield? You could do something like that. Neither of those guys is exactly like the battering ram fullback type, and Sam Williams-Dixon certainly isn't either. But there's a bunch of different ways you could sort of structure this. I'm sort of coming around to the idea of whether it's G. Scott or maybe one of the tight ends, maybe it's Bennett Christian. We don't know. We haven't seen him for a year. But, is it someone like that who is sort of the battering ram fullback kind of type?
And as a 6'5" guy, I'm not expecting it to be Bennett Christian. I don't know that they have that guy, and maybe you adjust your offense to what you have, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have Mitch Rossi, so they made do with Chip Trayanum, but that dude is like 230 pounds. They don't have anybody else like that on the roster. In terms of who is going to replace Xavier Johnson, I don't see why you can't have Brandon Inniss running some of those jet sweeps, and even it's rare for a receiver to run between the tackles. That is something that made Xavier Johnson rare. That is something that was always Urban Meyer's white whale that he would get every now and again with Percy Harvin and Curtis Samuel. He wanted those guys to be able to run between the tackles. Dontre Wilson. Brandon Inniss played quarterback in his senior year because of an injury, so he ran the ball plenty. I could see them using him in a number of ways, and I think you should. I don't think you just have to throw it to him. I'm not, like I said, I'm not expecting between the tackle stuff. You adjust your offense to what you have. But Zach Herbstreit was a guy that was talked about in that Mitch Rossi role. We'll see what his health, I don't know what that means for him. But at this point, I don't know that they have that, and I'm just wondering if they want to go get it. Or if you ask G. Scott to do that, does that derail the whole plan of being this downfield, this versatile passing weapon? I think it kind of does. So I don't know that you even go that route. And again, they'll do with what they have. It's going to be interesting to see how they eventually use Demarion Witten, because he is not your standard tight end. He's a ridiculously freakish athlete. When you watch him on the field, he does things that tight ends aren't supposed to do. Max LeBlanc is more of a traditional, but again, give him a couple years before we see anything. So I think they just have to figure out what they're going to do, who they have to do it. And it's going to look a bit different than it did this past year, and maybe they do some more two-back sets with just actual running backs and deal with that situation. So,
I think this is my favorite question that we've ever gotten, because we got one question in this entire show. We just did 30 minutes on one question, and the answer is, well, I don't know. It depends on who comes back and, what kind of offense they're running. So thank you for your question.
Sorry we couldn't answer it. But definitely thank you for that question. I want to thank you all for all of the questions. As always, whenever we throw requests out there, you guys never fail to help us out. So we do appreciate that. So as we wrap up, go ahead and hit the thumbs up on this video if you're watching it on YouTube. We do appreciate that. Subscribe to the channel if you have not. Hit the bell to be notified whenever we drop videos, because there's always stuff going on. And since there is always stuff going on, you can find us at BuckeyeHuddle.com talking about it there on the Huddle message board. If you're not yet a member, become a member. It is a fantastic way to support what we do. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll talk to you guys later.